Hello, folks. Welcome back to our guide to the campaign editor in Together in Battle. In today's episode, we're going to talk about creating battle maps. Now, if you've ever played a strategy RPG before, you know exactly what these are. These are basically grids, kind of almost like a chessboard, but, of varying sizes. And you've got your characters right there on the grid, and you can control them in a turn-based fashion. Let's go ahead and click New Map to create one. Now, you may recall that in our last episode, when we created the introduction cutscene, we said that the scene after introduction will be called Battle 1. Let's just name our battle that exact thing. We can also set a width and a height. It doesn't have to be these particular dimensions. We can set something pretty arbitrary to our taste. And voila! This takes us directly to the map settings screen. Here you can see the name that we put in. We can change it here if we like. We can select music. Let's go ahead and pick Against All Odds. Victory Aura. This is how much money the player will win if they win the battle. Let's go ahead and set that to 500. This is Victory Morale. This is Lost Morale. They do exactly what it says on the tin. If you win, your characters gain morale. If you lose, your characters lose morale. Saveable. If you leave this clicked, and you should for most battles, then the player can save the game. If you don't leave that clicked, then the game is going to assume that this is some sort of end game screen where the player shouldn't be able to save the game. Procedurally generated. You want to leave this unclicked unless you want the game to procedurally generate a brand new battle every time the player gets to this scene. We're probably not going to talk about that too much in this episode, but in a future episode, we may discuss exactly how you set up a procedurally generated battle of this sort. Multiplayer. We're going to leave that unchecked because this is not going to be multiplayer. This is part of a single player campaign, but if you were creating a campaign designed to be played by multiple human players, or at least treated in that fashion, you would click this, and this would affect certain rules for how the game treats victory and loss conditions. Up here in the top right, we have Next Scene. This is just like the Next Scene field from our cutscene editor. We just put in the name of whatever scene comes after this. We'll just put here 1 Battle 1. And then when we create a scene called 1 Battle 1, if the player wins this battle, they will proceed to 1 Battle 1. Defeat Scene. This one is optional. We don't have to actually put anything here. If we leave this blank, then if the player loses the battle, the game will immediately restart it so that the player can try again. That's assuming that, it's mandatory for the player to win the battle. If, on the other hand, you want something to happen where the player moves on and maybe the campaign branches in some fashion upon defeat, or if you just don't even really care if the player wins, you could even just reuse this, just put 1 Battle 1 here also. But you could also put a different scene. You could be like Lost Battle 1, and then you could have a totally different scene acting out what happens if the player loses this battle. Background. This is something that is new to Together in Battle. You can put in battlefield backgrounds. Scale offset. These are for the battlefield backgrounds. One I think you could use is just black. Let's try confirming that. So if we save this and go to test, let's see if there is in fact a black background. There is, look at that. So that is one battlefield background, but needless to say, there are others. Moving on to our remaining settings, we have objectives. These are not actually going to hook into the game's code. These are just things that are displayed to the player. So if we put defeat all enemies here, that's just basically flavor text to let the player know, hey, this is what you're trying to do in this battle. Now, you can have up to 5 different objectives total here, but you can actually add more through script action. We may get to that later. Let's talk about armies and conditions. These are the last 2 important things to know about in the map setting screen. armies. You can have up to 6 armies on the field at a time. You can tell the game, I want these to be AI armies, or I want them to be human-controlled armies. If the AI checkbox is not checked, the game will say, oh, okay, these are human-controlled armies. And you can change the color just by clicking these little tents. Like if you want the player's army to be, say, orange or something. But by default, we're using Fire Emblem colors. Army 0 is blue and player-controlled. Army 1 is red and AI-controlled. And Army 2, I'm referring to the numbers here, rather than what it says in the name field. So Army 0, Army 1, Army 2. Army 2 is green and also AI-controlled. And if you wanted this to really behave like it does in Fire Emblem, you could make it so that Army 0 and Army 2 are allied. And you do that by just putting 2 in Army 0's allies field, and going to Army 2's allies field and putting 0. This now means that Army 2 considers Army 0 an ally, and Army 0 considers Army 2 an ally. You don't have to do it in both armies' things if you want it to be asymmetrical. So, for example, if we took this out of Army 2's allies list, Army 0 would consider Army 2 allied, but Army 2 would not consider Army 0 an ally. So members of Army 2 would still attack Army 0. Maybe you want to have a scenario like that. I don't know. The game lets you do it, but for now, let's just treat the Green Army as our ally in typical Fire Emblem fashion. You will notice up here you can assign a roster to different armies. We don't really need to do that, at least not at this particular moment in time. By default, the player's roster is roster 0, which you may recall we created when we created the introduction cutscene. So we don't really need to assign a different roster to the player here, but if we had created a different roster and we wanted the player to be in control of that other roster, we could use assign roster to make that happen here. And likewise, if we wanted these AI armies to make use of pre-made rosters of unique characters, we could assign them here as well. The last thing I want to note here on the army screen is we have these little toggles here beneath the color chooser and above the AI toggle. This tells the game what AI profile to use for each army. We've got balanced, aggressive, homicidal, cautious, defensive, protective, greedy, unpredictable, mindless, stupid, and you can create your own custom AI profiles by editing, you guessed it, aiprofiles.xml in your campaign folder. Alright, that's all we need to know for now. Let's go ahead and hit confirm. Having done that, let's now look at conditions. These are all kinds of things you can set up to change the lighting, the weather, the victory conditions, the loss conditions, and all sorts of other rules as they pertain to this particular battle. You can see a bunch of example conditions in these text fields here. One big one that's important to be aware of is deployment, shown down here. Deployment is what calls up that little window where you can click characters and set where they spawn on the battlefield. As with every condition, it is optional, but you should get familiar with it if in fact you want to have the player deploy their own characters in battle. We will come back to this screen in the future, but for now let's just hit confirm. We'll leave it as is, and we'll hit confirm. And look at that, we are now on the main screen of the map editor. You will notice we have this cursor here that we can kind of move around. You'll notice in the top left there, it is showing us the coordinates, and it is showing us the elevation. We can edit the elevation by clicking these little elevation buttons, elevation plus and elevation minus. Let's say we wanted to have a little hill here, just click elevation plus, and we start painting the terrain until we have elevated it to elevation 2. One thing that's pretty neat is you can fill with any kind of terrain you see here. So you don't have to just, start with a bunch of grass, you could have dirt, for example. And then you could paint on grass to change the appearance of the battlefield. I'm using the right mouse button in order to pan the screen around. You can do this too when you're in the map editor. Alright, so those are some of the most basic things to know when you're editing terrain. You can use the eyedropper tool to select a type of terrain, and then it will allow you to just immediately paint terrain of that type. Another thing to note is there's a special type of terrain known as hazard terrain. All these ones in the very rightmost column. These automatically appear on a lower elevation than the other terrain. So if you scroll over this, you'll see it is elevation 0, whereas everything around it is elevation 1. You may have noticed when we started painting that in, it looked a little weird. That is because there aren't transitions between multiple terrain types available for any of these tiles. So, we want to make sure that any given tile of terrain is touching only one other type of terrain. That's just a limitation of this engine. That is something I intend to fix in future engines that I create, but in Together in Battle, just be aware this is a limitation. Having painted the terrain, we next move on to objects. We can search through objects by just sort of scrolling through using these page buttons here, or we can type things. Let's say we want a tree. We can just type tree, and it's going to immediately filter it down to all objects which have tree in their name. We've got regular trees, dead trees, fruit trees, snowy trees, explosive trees, and gray explosive trees. Plenty of options for us to choose from. Let's just pick a regular tree for now. Anywhere we want a tree, we just click, and voila, we got some trees. Simple as that. We've got other trees too that aren't showing up because they don't have tree in the name, but they are also trees, like evergreens. We've also got some ginkgo trees, and so on. We even got some banyans that you may recall seeing in Together in Battle. One particular type of terrain that it is important to be aware of are reeds. Reeds are tall grasses that act as defensive terrain that both the player and the AI can stand in to get a dodge boost and some increased resistance to physical damage. It is important to make use of this if you want to take full advantage of all the terrain available in the game. We have other types of special terrain, like we've got puddles. Puddles make it hard to dodge, so they're kind of like bad terrain, whereas these are good terrain. We've got fire. You just have a fire tile out there. Maybe there's a forest fire going on. And there's so many other things, like there's no need to limit yourself to just one or two objects like that. Let's save our map. Actually, I'm going to get rid of this fire because we don't really need fire. One more thing you can do in a map like this is you can add lights. So let's go ahead and take a look. We've got point lights and we've got directional lights. Outdoors like this, in a scene like this, it doesn't necessarily make a ton of sense to have directional lights. Directional lights are like lights you have, say, coming in an open door from outside, or coming in through windows from the outside, or maybe like a cave entrance. So like this, for example. Right, this is a directional light. You can then click it, rotate it, change some of its values. We'll hit confirm, and now it's yellow. It's facing right. That's an example of a directional light. Again, doesn't make a ton of sense outdoors. Point light. This is exactly like the directional light, except it is omnidirectional. It is not pointed in any particular direction. If we wanted to make this sort of a yellow color, we could do that. We can change its size, we can change its intensity, and we can change its X and Y coordinates. Here I'm just going to move it over 2 to the right. Boom. Simple and easy. Let's see our map. So those are all like the little incidental things. Let's talk about the last important thing to know when you're creating a map, and that is the characters. If we click this, we have a bunch of options to choose from as far as characters we can place onto the battlefield. You will notice in the top left here we have From Player Roster. If we wanted the game to just automatically pull characters from the player's roster, we would place these little From Roster guys onto the battlefield, and the game would auto-populate these spaces in the order we placed them with whoever is in the player's roster and still alive. However, we don't really have to do that here because we happen to already have our characters, and this is the very first battle. We know they're all still alive, so we can just place them onto the battlefield manually. Here we've got Jack, we've got Liszarid, and we've got Rosemary Flower Thicket. So those are our 3 starting good guys, and now we can go and start placing down some bandit choppers for them to fight. You'll notice here it says Army 0. We can click this in order to change that to Army 1. And we can also click this to change their starting orientation. So let's place down a bandit chopper here. Let's place down maybe a bandit chopper here. And maybe 2 bandit choppers here. And let's save the game. Having placed these characters, we might want to edit them in some way. We might say, okay, instead of having these guys start down here, why don't we have them start up at the campfire, right? Maybe in the story we can say that they were at camp when they saw these enemies. So it'll make more sense for them to be up here. We click Edit Character, we click a character. Here we've got Rosemary Flower Thicket selected, and we can see all kinds of different properties for Rosemary. We can edit army, we can edit X and Y coordinates, we can edit the turn on which Rosemary spawns, we can edit her orientation, add tags, add triggers, and even give her items to start the battle off with. Instead of editing her X and Y coordinates in these fields, I'm just going to left-click right on the battlefield, and you will notice that that has changed the coordinates in the bottom right to match what we have showing in our little coordinates preview in the top left. All I have to do is click confirm, and voila, there she is, sitting at 0, 1. And now we can do the same for Liz and Jack. And just like that, we have changed the starting position of our characters. Let's save. One thing you may recall from the main game is that elevation matters. So starting these guys off on this elevated space means that they will have an advantage if this guy walks up and tries to fight them. It may be to their advantage to just kind of stay there. And that's cool if that's what you want in the battle, like if you want the player to have an incentive to just kind of turtle. But when I design maps, I oftentimes like to give the player an incentive to get off the starting area and go claim territory, give them a little bit of a risk-reward thing going on. So here, let's go give them a reason to leave that starting area. We can place treasure chests. I'm going to place one here. And I'm going to place a one facing the other direction using chest alt. And I'm going to place that over here. Now, let's save the map. It's all well and good to place chests, but you have to actually put stuff in the chests or else, what's the point? So we're going to hit Edit Object, we're going to click our chests, and we're going to edit their inventory. There are a whole bunch of different things we can put inside of chests. This, for instance, we could put bandages, and we could put so many possibilities. Let's add 25 coins. This is a relatively easy to reach chest, so bandages and 25 coins is probably good enough. Confirm. And this one is a little harder to get to, so maybe we'll add 75 coins. And maybe we'll add maybe a whetstone or a repair kit, or maybe just some eye drops. There we go. So we've now created this very basic battlefield. Let's say we wanted a bridge spanning across here. We would go to New Object. We would find a bridge of the type we want, like say a wooden bridge, and we would just create it. Now, one thing to note, when you place a bridge over a tile like this, it's going to appear submerged because it's at elevation 0. So we actually have to add a tag in order to make it show up. 11. That tells the game we're setting this thing's elevation manually. We're going to add a comma, and then for its parameter, we're going to use that familiar thing we talked about in the last video, the operator and the amount equals, :1. This tells the game we are setting the elevation of this bridge tile equal to 1. We hit confirm, and now it is above the water. Do the same for this. And voila, now we have a bridge stretching across the water. Anytime you put something in water, it is going to appear submerged unless you change its elevation. And that's normal. You know, so you're probably going to want that for a lot of things, like if we have a boulder in the water here, right? We want that partly submerged. So there it makes sense to leave its elevation at 0. But for a bridge, we want to increase it. Let's save the map. Alright, one more thing I want to talk about before we hit play. I want you to take a look at how these characters behave when we start testing. You'll probably notice that they're not behaving the way you would expect them to. So here, we don't have any dialogue at the start of the mission, so Jack here has been sort of randomly selected to give his deployment dialogue. I don't know about you all, but if I must fight, then I'm going to look cool doing it. So we're going to end the turn here and take a look. And see how they behave. So that's expected. The enemy runs up and attacks. He's already in range. But look at this. Everyone is going to bum rush our characters. That's not actually what we probably want in this, especially if the goal is to get the player to come down and loot these treasure chests. They're never going to have the opportunity. They're going to be stuck engaging around this area. So we've got some information now we can use to go back and edit. So the main thing we want to do to change enemy behaviors is add tags to the enemies. We can do this with each individual character in order to affect how they behave. There's 3 basic types of tags that you use to do this. One is called passive, one is called immobile, and one is called inactive. Passive just says, okay, this character is going to stay put, they're not going to move, and they're not going to attack unless someone wanders into move and attack range. If someone is in their move and attack range, they will go after them, but otherwise they're going to just kind of stay put. So that's passive. Immobile is a little bit stronger. Immobile says they are not going to move no matter what, but if someone moves into their attack range, they will attack. And then you have inactive. Inactive is they're going to neither move nor attack no matter what. Now that might seem a little strange. You probably are thinking, why would I ever want to do that? And the answer is because there is another tag you can give them called Pursue. Pursue listens for when a character gets attacked by an enemy, and if they do, it removes any passive, immobile, or inactive tag that might be on that character. So we'll add Pursue to these characters as well, meaning that if they get attacked, they're going to become aggressive. They're not... You can't just hit them and then run back out of move and attack range and expect them to just kind of still sit there. So, okay, that's cool, you might say, but what if we want to, like, sort of group enemies together? What if we want an attack on either of these two to trigger both of them? Well, I got good news. There is another tag for that. Aggro group. If you put enemies in the same aggro group, in this case we're assigning aggro group 0, then if one of them becomes aggroed, if one of them loses a tag like passive, immobile, or inactive, it will strip those tags from everyone else in that aggro group. So these two are now in aggro group 0, meaning that if one of them is aggroed, the other becomes aggroed. Let's save the map. And let's test out some of this behavior by our enemies once more. Alright, let's end the turn and see what they do. Okay, so none of the enemies came after our characters except for this one guy who isn't passive. But they did attack this treasure chest. That treasure chest happened to be in their move and attack range. And they happen to have an AI profile that permits looting. As you can see, they are set to arena, and that allows them to go after treasure chests. If you don't want enemies looting chests, you have a few options. One is to just set them to an AI profile that ignores chests, right? Like balanced, for example. But there's another way to do this. We don't have to change the entire AI profile. We can go bit by bit using tags and tell the AI to ignore specific objects. So, for example, we can put tags on these chests. There's a particular tag called Treat as Army. For all purposes in general, it's going to be Army 99. But when the AI looks at it, it's going to say, oh, we're going to pretend this is part of Army 1. Characters that belong to Army 1 are not going to go after this thing. They're not going to treat it as a target. Let's save the map and see if that fixed it. And voila! It did. These guys are now ignoring the chest. You may notice, by the way, that Liszarid's damage keeps changing. That is because he's getting a different procedurally generated mace every time we test out this map. That's okay. If we really wanted to give him a specific mace, we could create one in the item editor and give it to him. For now, proc gen is fine. Let's quit. Alright, so we've got all these enemy axe fighters. And we could go out to the character creator and create a bunch of new enemy types to sprinkle into the battle. But what if we wanted to be lazy? What if we just wanted to procedurally generate some enemies? Well, luckily, that is an option. If you go to New Character, let's set this to Army 1, set default rotation to up, we can click this here, procedurally generate a unit. We click this, and we get this pop-up. So our current enemies are called Bandit Choppers. Suppose we wanted to have a Bandit Bowman. When we come down to class, we specify Bowman. We give it a level faction. Well, let's say Bandits. We don't really need to worry about salary or salary variance, since this is not going to be a character that gets recruited by the player. And we might not even be working with salary in our campaign to begin with, so most of the time you can ignore these fields. We are going to go with either species. We could probably leave this blank because the only species that can have access to the bowman class is human. But if we were generating something like a pyrokineticist or a psi healer or another class that is accessible across species, you can specify the species here and it will only create an instance of that class of the specified species. Do we want to generate an inventory? No, we do not. Do we want it to be a unique unit? No, we do not. Confirm. And now we can click to add a bandit bowman. The game has just sort of generated a character with stats that are normal for that class based on that class's sort of default attributes. You can change that, incidentally. There is a file that should exist in your campaign's folder called classes.xml. Feel free to open that up in a program like Notepad, or better yet, Notepad++, and you can edit the classes to your heart's desire, and that will then be reflected in any characters you procedurally generate in your maps. So, okay, we've got a bowman here. Let's procedurally generate an enemy swordsman as well, and we'll call this Bandit Boss. And this guy's going to be a little tougher. Let's make him level 5. And let's say, in this case, we want this to be a dude specifically. Generate inventory. Yeah, sure. Let's give the player a nice little loot drop when this character dies. Unique? Meh. We don't really need to do that. If we did want him to be a unique boss, though, we would click this, and we could leave it as Bandit Boss, or we could have the game come up with a character name for us. Hit random, or we could also just write a name ourselves. Clarence the Chaotic. Alright. There's Clarence, a level 5 swordsman. Let's go ahead and make Clarence mobile. Let's give him Pursue, and assign him to Aggro Group 1. And let's do much the same for this bowman, but we'll be tricky. With the bowman, we'll make the bowman passive instead of just immobile. This way, if anyone wanders into move and attack range of the bowman will trigger. We'll walk and shoot them. That will aggro Clarence, and then Clarence will follow up. But Clarence will not strike the first blow if people wander into move and attack range of this bowman. Alright. Let's save the map. Another thing we could do, maybe we don't want Clarence to show up at the start, we can change his spawn turn. So because the player is Army 0, everyone is showing up on turn 0, that's going to be the player's turn. If we want Clarence to show up, unless you want to do what's called an ambush spawn, which is where an enemy shows up and can act on that same turn, you probably want him to spawn on a player's turn. Right now, we have 3 different armies, right? We have a green army here that we could use for NPCs. Just to make the math a little simpler, let's get rid of this. And we'll take them out of the allies for Army 0. Confirm. Okay, so now if we go back to edit Clarence, every even turn is going to be a player turn, right? Turn 0 is the players. Turn 1 is the bandits. Turn 2 is the player again. Turn 3 is the bandit again, and so on and so forth. Let's say we want Clarence to show up on turn 6. And let's say we want his bowman escort to also show up on turn 6. Let's save. That way we get 3 rounds before the boss shows up. Let's test it out. Alright. So, as you see, the boss is not here yet, but he will show up in a few rounds. Let's let the enemies move. Very good. So if we want to check, it says here turn 2, right? That tells us the turn that we are currently on in the battle. There's Jack. Let's have Rosemary take a shot at this guy. And Bliss can finish him. Alright, these enemies remain passive. If we wander into range, though, that should aggro the both of them. And there we go. The entire group has been aggroed. I'd like to shove them into each other. Does Liz have any dodge? 4%. Meh. Not really substantial enough that I really need to worry about the dodge malice from this puddle. Okay. Let's end the turn. And look at that. The boss has shown up now. Passive character comes after us because we wandered into his move and attack range. As expected. Grab this. And let's see if we can aggro the boss and the bowman. The answer is yes, we can in fact aggro them both. Alright, so things are looking pretty good. We can obviously tweak this a bunch, you know, add more enemies, add more points of interest, maybe edit the terrain a bit to add some elevation effects, things of that nature. But probably what we want to do more than that is, let's see, there we go. Yeah, we don't really have a good transition for that tile next to that. So what we could do instead is maybe add some elevation here. Make that a little more interesting. That becomes a good place to engage the enemies. And we can, you know, we can do other things. We can, like, shuffle some of these destructible objects around to different spots. Encourage engaging. 1, 2, 3, 4. Encourage engaging on certain points by adding defensive terrain. And so on. Let's look at a cool little feature that we have here called Generate Map. This allows you to generate an entire battle from scratch, basically, and just sort of work off of it. This is a very quick and easy way for you to get a battle to sort of work off of. There. That is a pretty interesting map right there. You might not want to leave it like that, but that is a starting point, right? And you can just kind of keep generating over and over, using whatever sort of parameters appeal to you, right? We could reduce the amount of hazard tiles, we could reduce the maximum elevation, we could smooth things out if we want to have a little bit more of a flat terrain. And maybe what we actually want, more than anything, is larger areas with, like, maybe only a couple, but, like, they take up a ton of space, like this here, to kind of simulate having, like, a lake, for instance, over in the corner. And obviously you are not limited to just using grass and dirt. You can have a sort of a dirty lava cave, right? You can generate that and work off of that. There's all kinds of different terrain available to use with the generate map feature. But we are not going to use a generated map. We are going to stick with our hand-designed map for now. But just know, you can generate something and then just continue to refine it, placing objects, placing enemies, and so on. And we haven't even talked about the fact that you can generate objects and enemies using this. You know, any object you can find in the new object screen, you can set as part of an object set in the generate map function. And likewise with enemy units, you can have it just sort of generate enemies with different groups consisting of different types of classes that it will sort of pull from at random. And you can even set aggressiveness, which will sort of tell the game, you know, how many of these characters are going to have a passive tag, and, you know, how quickly is that going to be removed. These are all things you can sort of set up by default and just sort of keep re-rolling until the game produces something you like. The dialogue editor. Now hold on, Craig, you might say. We've already covered this. We did the dialogue editor when we did our introduction cutscene. And yes, we did, but dialogue in battle is a little bit different. And the reason is the triggers actually matter here. There are a few different triggers that cause any dialogue you create in battle to occur at different times. Onloaded. You want to use onloaded dialogue to sort of set things up before the player even sees the battle. So if you want to randomly drop things or edit character stats based on, you know, certain variables, onloaded is very good for that. Probably the most basic one other than onloaded is on turn. And here you just supply a turn number, and when it gets to be that turn, it will trigger the dialogue. I think the game wants us to enter a conversation ID. Clarence appears. There we go. So, if we go back here, we may recall, Clarence the Chaotic is the name of our boss. We'll go back to the dialogue editor, we will add a branch, and we will make the speaker Clarence the Chaotic. Mwahaha! It is time to kick the crud out of some good guys. Cracks his knuckles eagerly. Alright, so a few things here that are also different from doing this in a cutscene environment. If you have a speaker who is actually someone present on the battlefield, you are going to want to add a move cam action. This will automatically move the game camera, either to a specific set of coordinates or to wherever a particular named character happens to be located. We could go back and look at where Clarence the Chaotic spawns. Personally, I don't much care to do that. I think it's easier to just put Clarence the Chaotic in here and let the game figure out what coordinates he's at for us. You will notice I'm just deleting all of these optional parameters, but I am keeping the commas. That's important. Those commas tell the game, okay, this is that parameter, but it's blank, so we're going to ignore it. Second parameter was also optional, that was the X coordinate, also blank, we're ignoring it. This is also an optional parameter, but it's not blank, we're going to actually use this one. We are going to move the battle camera over to the specified character. Let's proceed. Next we want to, if you said add speaker portrait, you guessed right. We're going to have him facing left because he does spawn on the right side of the screen. We're going to give him a mean facial expression. And we don't really need to mess with these other ones. Because we're not only not using these parameters, but not using anything after them, we can delete them along with their commas and it'll be okay. Proceed. And let's try it out. Let's see how that does for us. Proceed. Exit. Save map. Let's test it out. And voila, just like that, we got some dialogue from our procedurally generated boss, Clarence the Chaotic. So that's a pretty good introduction, I think, to how this all works. But what if we wanted to add a little bit more drama? What if we wanted to, like, change the lighting and the weather? That is something that we handle in conditions. So weather, as you can see, all the weather types are listed over on the right. Let's do heavy rain. And let's change the global lighting. So there's a bunch of presets. We could do a custom RGB color scheme for global lighting, but I think overcast is going to work quite well for what we're doing here. Let's confirm that. Hit confirm. And oh, look at that. Look at that mood. And suddenly these puddles make way more sense too. So let's go ahead and save our map. And let's go to the dialogue editor and add a bit of dialogue so that we have a sound loop that matches our new weather. Let's call this setup. The trigger will be on loaded. And all we're going to do is add an action to play loop. And here we have a menu that comes up that shows us all of the sound loops available in the game. We're going to go with Rain Loud. Proceed. And then we're going to run an action called End Conv Immediately. This means that we are going to play the actions above it and then immediately end the conversation before anyone can see anything, because this is just an empty conversation that is purely a vehicle for playing this loop. Proceed, exit, save, and let's test it out. There you go, folks. So there's a lot more that we could talk about here, but I think this covers most of the basics. I strongly recommend going through the guide and looking at all of the different triggers that you can use for character dialogue, because there's a lot more than we covered here. If you want dialogue that happens before the turn, you use before turn. If you want dialogue that triggers when a character is attacked, you use on-char attacked. After a character is attacked, when a character dies, when a character is selected, when a door is opened, when an item sack is grabbed. You can also set areas of the battlefield and have triggers that are sort of tripped when a character of a particular army, or even a specific character, reaches that area. There's so much that you can experiment with in this. I highly recommend playing around and seeing what kind of cool stuff you can do. Anyway, folks, that is all for this particular episode. If you have any questions or anything you want to see me cover, please leave a comment below this video. I would love to answer your questions, and just as importantly, I would love to use your questions as fodder for forthcoming videos where I explain some of the finer points of making campaigns in Together in Battle's campaign editing suite. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.